on these priorities. And some of the issues that you see sort of underneath each one of those priorities are probably very similar to the engagement report that you've seen in the past, but those I look at as tactics to achieving the long-term goal. And so when the engagement plan comes back to you in January, they will be organized like this under the priorities. All right. So we talked a lot about what we want to spend the majority of our time on, but we still have to be responsive to those inbound requests. So what you have in front of you is a proposed flowchart about how to think about these issues. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of really quick recent examples to just demonstrate how we think about these issues. One, Mr. Keeley, you mentioned this one earlier, which is SeaWorld. I think many of you have received emails from this organization, but it's basically an email campaign from the World Animal Protection Group asking for us to divest from our assets in SeaWorld. Right now, our shares in SeaWorld are about $3.5 million, just to give you a frame of reference. So as we work through this flow chart, first we ask ourselves, is it an engagement priority? Does divesting from SeaWorld, does that line up with those priorities we talked about? Is it corporate and market accountability? Is it board effectiveness? Is it regarding the low carbon transition? At first glance, my answer to those is no. We go down the flowchart to, can investors influence the outcome? The ultimate goal here is for them to stop putting marine animals on display and keeping them in captivity. As an investor, I'm not sure that is my role. I think that the animal rights organization, that's probably a better path for them. And last but not least, we ask ourselves, do we really have the tools and resources to influence this issue? One, it's a $3.5 million investment. How much resources will that be effective or really affect the long-term performance of the overall CalSTRS portfolio? And I don't really have a whole lot of tools at my disposal to get a company to stop doing what's at the heart of their business model. So that's one. I also want to give you an example of one that actually would make it through the flowchart where we actually would engage, and that's around a mining and tailing safety initiative. So following the catastrophic tailings dam failure at a mining facility in Brazil, we were approached by the Church of England to be part of an engagement with the extractive industry to ask them to do better disclosures around the safety measures at their mining facilities. So we asked ourselves, it really wasn't an engagement priority for us, but we did say, I think investors could be influential in this outcome. And we had tools and resources because the Church of England was doing the heavy lifting for us. And so we made it sort of through the flowchart. We determined the resources required. This was a low ball for us in terms of resources. Like I said, the Church of England was organizing it. They were collecting signatories for a letter to, it was 726 different companies. There was measurable outcomes from this because 310 companies responded and continue to respond. 37 out of the top 50 mining companies made further disclosures around safety measures to protect the lives of their workers and people in their communities. So that's just one example, or two examples actually. And last but not least are the next steps. So while this is an information item, I am looking for some affirmation from the board and input about the framework and if this makes sense, because we would like to bring back the engagement plan in January. Remember that typically the engagement plan, you've been the primary audience, but we really want to expand the scope of the plan, not only to communicate to our investment peers, but our stakeholders to really talk about what our priorities are and what we're trying to achieve. And then obviously the flow chart I just walked you through, we want to adopt a process whether that be in policy or part of the engagement plan about how we're going to tackle these ad hoc requests. And then last but not least, I think the value of engagements is a really great way to communicate to you our success, but also to the marketplace. So I know that was a whole lot, but I'm happy to take any questions.
And Harry, I'd like to just finish off with one outside observation. Ever since we took quick action on firearms after Sandy Hook, we've been at the forefront of most groups coming and approaching us to bring about change on their particular issues. And we really have seen a huge jump. I can't emphasize enough Harry's words and Scott's words. We need your help. We're drowning in outside interests wanting us to advocate for their behalf. Can you go back one slide? You have a really precious resource in this team. Dana will and Jack will remember we spent offsite after offsite in the old days talking about branding our corporate governance unit. And I can say after a decade, we did it. We lapped the competition. But it's not an unlimited resource. So you can spread it thin on 100 issues, and I guarantee you they won't really move the needle on any of them. But as the fiduciaries, it's really important for you to focus that resource on what you think is important to you and what you care about. And we need this kind of a tool because I can already foresee that in March, it's going to be a border wall, or it's going to be, I hate to say it, anti-vaccination, or some other issue. SeaWorld, something's going to happen. You're going to get bombarded. You're going to care about it, but we've got to bring it through this. So what we really need you today to do is tell us whether you can buy into this kind of a flow chart and you can let us stick to that discipline. And it means me coming to you and saying, no, we're not going to devote resources because you didn't make it a priority.
Okay, so thank you for the presentation. I think it's clear in terms of what you're looking for in terms of direction. Let me turn it over to folks that are in the queue. This is some really good thinking behind the charts. Yep. and something that's concrete and very visible. These three buckets, ask ourselves, corporate market accountability, board effectiveness, low carbon transition through the chart. Can we be, it's really helpful. So, okay, Sharon.
So first, I really appreciate this. The flow charts help me organize the thinking because I think sometimes as we've developed the SIS program, it just, there's a lot going on. And so I think this has helped me organize my thinking. And I think it will help us, to your point, Chris, give you clearer direction when we are approached. The three things I heard, Scott mentioned them and they're in the write-up. The three things that I heard, so I'm just going to say them out loud and keep them in my notes. Materiality, what's material to the fund? What do we have influence over? And outcomes and measures or / measures. So I think that helps me as a board member think about the issue you're asking us for, which is direction from us and sort of how do we, we have big hearts on this board and we care about teachers in California. And so that helps me as a fiduciary to think about how we ask staff to engage on some of these issues. One area that I was curious, and I know you're gonna come back and fill out more of this, right? But one of the areas that I've been kind of curious to have you fill out, and maybe you'll do that next time, is the corporate and market accountability. Can you just give more examples? I mean, you mentioned the SEC ruling, which I think is crazy, and I read about that yesterday, and that's pretty outlandish. But also some of the work that I know PRI and Ceres is doing on engaging banks on more sustainable banking. Can you give examples? I mean, I've been thinking a lot about policy lately and how we can drive policy at the federal level if we can at this point. Certainly, I think at the state level with the governor, there's policies we can drive on sustainable policy in the state. But can you talk a little bit more about when you say corporate and market accountability, maybe examples of how we could move the needle and be influential? Are we thinking about some of those areas? Are we engaging with the SEC? I know you're talking to them through CII.
we do engage with the SEC. I mean, in fact, last fall, I was asked to participate on a roundtable in regards to like the proxy plumbing issues. I think that another thing that I would sort of put in this area is the issue of dual class shares. You know, it's something that affects the entire market, and it makes it makes us unable to actually affect change at those companies. So I think that's one example. But it's broad.
It's also what we're trying to show here is that we don't want to. When we were even talking about this amongst ourselves, we sort of said we're trying to give what we believe are clear guidance on what we think we should prioritize. And already there's a huge amount of issues just up here. And I'm very conscious of that. So it's trying to say that we think the most important elements under corporate and market accountability are shareholder rights. We have to, and that's all that went on yesterday at the SEC. And that's about dual class shares. You know, when there are double voting rights or, you know, whatever, we don't have that same opportunity. So that's why shareholder rights is so integral. Audit, I think obviously everybody would agree, you know, if there aren't solid audit practices, really big challenge. And if we don't get better disclosure and information, this is where SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, to help us better articulate materiality for companies related to ESG, to save us sort of getting into the spiral of everybody thinks every ESG issue is material to every single company all of the time. I recognize that. That's why we've picked out those three subtopics as being the most important. And whilst there are other, you know, policy discussions going on, I know certainly, you know, the PRI work on the inevitable policy response would fit more under the low carbon transition when we talk about governance and disclosure there. But I think we have to be a little bit careful when we think about banking, and there are other initiatives going on. Again, if we could join an initiative at very low resources and help add our weight, brilliant. But I would like us to be able, if possible, to focus on those areas where I think are most intensely in our wheelhouse.
And this helps me, I mean, I think, if I may, just the partnerships you mentioned, I mean, many of us are partnering with a lot of these organizations, so we can definitely drive change through those relationships. I think this slide, the tactics slide, does, I think, do what Chris is asking from us, which is, you know, let's stay in our lanes as far as your team and what we can do at CalSTRS. We certainly have other relationships to affect change in other places through those other organizations. But I think this gives you probably, most importantly, your team, the ability to say, you know, not now, or this is not part of our priority this year. It doesn't mean we'll never tackle it. And I think sometimes we can get very broad, and I think it helps us be narrow in our focus, and I think that'll be a helpful tool for us moving forward this year.
Kirsty, I'm going to ask you and Aisha to please drill down on the importance of shareholder rights and the types of resources that need to be dedicated to that issue, given where we are in time, and how all other issues really rest on the shareholder rights. If we don't have that voice and that presence, what happens to everything else that we're trying to accomplish to effectuate change and mitigate risk? So if you could drill down on that issue, I think it's very important.
Now to
yes, please.
Sure. Well, sorry, I thought you meant. It was really a case in point yesterday, as Aisha sort of, you know, alluded to. I feel very fortunate that we have an expert in Aisha who follows us and has incredibly close connections with all of these market sort of frameworks and a direct link into sort of SEC as well, to be able to, when the news came out that obviously there was going to be a hearing on shareholder rights, basically the proxy process, as well as a right for shareholders to put a resolution forward at companies. New guidance is essentially going to be limiting our ability to do that. That you spent the entire day pretty much, you know, speaking with people, trying to respond, trying to make sure that we put out a comment today to show our concerns. And then the work now will begin to sort of actually provide a comment letter to the SEC to articulate our concerns. And so that's just one example of one person, one day, you know, needing to absolutely dedicate the time to that, but that's amplified.
I'm mindful that I'm chairing the meeting and I'm not a member of the committee, but what we're really, one of the big things we want to take away from today's meeting is it's a perfect example. We get an email campaign on a $3 million commitment that if we start prioritizing and going to staff and saying, we want you to dedicate resources to this, an issue like shareholder rights falls off the priority list. And that is counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish. So I think it's important for us to really be clear and like be thoughtful about that going forward. Dana and then Bill.
Can't tell, there's so much stuff up here, I can't tell when my mics are going green or not. Just a couple of things. If we could go one more slide forward, please. To the flow chart. I like the flow chart, and I like being, giving you the tools that you need to decide whether you're going to engage or not. I do want not to have items precluded that might not reach the level of materiality that others do. And Chris, I'm looking at some, there have been times that stakeholders have come to you or constituents have come to you on something that's pretty, maybe not necessarily material to the fund. And I'm thinking about the pesticides in the strawberry fields, where there was severe impact upon our students and their parents. And we were able to take care of that without necessarily making a big brouhaha out of it. And so I want us to have the flexibility to continue to do things like that. I think this flow chart makes that possible, but I just wanted to say that
It's a
going
challenge.
forward. It is.
When you say not a big brouhaha, we've spent considerable resources. I had to fly twice to meetings overseas to meet with, because it was a Japanese pesticide company owned in London. It was one of 49 products they had. So it's an interesting discussion, and I think given Harvey's recent memo on the issues we're dealing with, I think we just have to be really focused and decide those kind of things, and interject maybe the chair of the committee or the consultants to help give some advice. But from a materiality, and I tried to share, materiality is still something we struggle with defining. I hate to say that wouldn't move the materiality needle, but I know it riled up a lot of the membership.
Yeah, thanks. And go ahead.
Add to that, I think what it might help do is we can still always listen to every issue, but when we kind of then flow it through the flow chart and it's a no, 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 then we have a discussion hopefully about what are the level of resources required, and maybe the guidance on that being high, medium and low. It helps us all level set about where we can place it, if that helps.
No, I think for what I'm talking about, I think flows through that well. But divesting from that wasn't material to our fund. So I don't want us to, if something's, I'm not saying it very well. If something is not, it's not going to be, if it doesn't rise to that materiality, if some of these other things are lower and it's not going to cost us a whole bunch and we're able to do something, I think we ought to be able to do that.
That's the balance. I'm going to dive in because I've lived these. That's the balance we have to decide how to make that determination.
I agree with
Jack brought up Hugo Boss. They were closing a suit manufacturer in Cleveland and the politicians went nuts. And I want to clarify, because you said divesting. We did not divest. That chemical is not used in California, but it is used everywhere else in the world. And so, and we still are invested with that firm because it brings up the challenge. And that's all I want to say to you is that high, medium, and low deals with how much time and labor do you want to throw at particular issues. And we got to find a better mechanism and tool to decide that. And I hate to say, but Kirsty's realized from her time that she's been here coming up on almost a year, 11 months now, that if we say no and we don't devote resources to a problem, they come to you and stand here and comment and complain and complain and complain. But it's like we have to find a way to communicate to say, that didn't make our priority list. Maybe next year, if the board wants to make that a number one priority, we'll devote it. But I take orders from you on what we do.
Absolutely. And there's nothing that precludes the board from making that decision when things come to us too. So I totally agree with that. And then the last thing I'd like to ask is, this item was a really good reminder for me of all the places we have ESG policy. We have our investment belief, the IPMP, the investment policy for mitigating ESG risk. So where does the corporate governance principles fall into all that? Because that's another document that we have.
It is, and if you recall, the corporate governance principles used to sit inside the Teachers Retirement Board manual. We made the decision to take it out because it is a document that is more outward facing. It helps communicate, because it is a board-approved document, but it is meant to communicate not only to portfolio companies, but our investment peers, and we wanted to be able to point people to various aspects of the principles, and so we just wanted it to be more visible. So it's referenced in the policy, but it's a separate document.
But Dana, I think one of the things we'd like to do when we bring back in January a sort of revision on the policy that reflects some of this language is, even me sort of coming in new, our own governance is challenging to work out, well, how does it sit with, as you said, the belief, the IPMP, the divestment policy, the ESG risk policy, so we'll try and put some, again, clarity and pictorial sort of representation around that, because I think that'll help continue to guide us as we look at the different levers that we have to manage these issues.
Thank you.
Bill?
Being the new guy on the block again, this is a very exciting element of analysis for investing. And I just had a recent opportunity to respond to some questions posed to me about how I feel about being on the CalSTRS board. And the thing that I find most refreshing is, I think Scott mentioned it, is this sort of holistic approach that we take to investing, and that we walk the walk and we talk the talk. And we're really committed both internally and externally in the investment world. But one of the overriding issues that I see here is that, as a fiduciary, my duty is to ensure that our funding plan is achieved. And I think the way I look at this is that this is sustainable economic growth. We've got to ensure that this is measured by sustainable economic growth. And so if there's a way, it's probably more an art than at this stage than basically a science. But if we can determine materiality on how it affects our sustained economic growth in our portfolio, I think that should be the way we prioritize. Again, I'm new to the block, but I'm just sort of thinking about my fiduciary duty. And so I think that with regard to other issues that we feel passionate about and we understand that it impacts the citizens and students of California, I think there are other means of achieving those goals that might be a better use of our, not calling on our resources. And I think that engagement, with all of these other associations that have like-minded participants is another way that we can achieve these things. But for me, I would like to see us determine some way to measure how it's going to impact our portfolio and our funding plan. That's how I think we should look at our resources.
May I, just to respond, I absolutely, and I bring back to the funnel here as we have it, that is the very much if I can actually get there, that is very much this sort of the long-term portfolio performance, how it is responding to sort of, our role in both investing and enabling sustainable economic growth has to be that first part of the funnel. And so when we think about the issues, the ones that we have chosen specifically, we are trying to address that what do we think will allow companies to be resilient in a changing world, that will hopefully also be, a sustainable economy for us. So thank you for those comments. I hear them very loud and clear.
Patty?
Thanks, Harry. I think the tactics you outlined is a very thoughtful it's a very thoughtful structure about how we need to think through these issues. And I think what I would say about kind of all the other things that come at us is the fact that we are a public body, and we're a convenient venue for a lot of people. And I guess I look at particularly some of the policy issues that come before us as I would characterize that under each of those three pillars of corporate market accountability, board effectiveness, and low carbon transition, there's policy work embedded in each of those. And so I wouldn't shortchange kind of the amount of time that you devote to just kind of the policy advocacy work that continues in each of those three categories. But so I would call those kind of like the capital P policy issues. And all the little p issues that come to us, I just think it's the wrong venue. And I personally would love to have the ability for Chris, you and your team to kind of help determine where we draw the line. And we're never going to get through the really intense work of getting to a low carbon transition if we're kind of dealing with all these other issues, not to minimize what they are, but really a lot of them require law changes, or maybe it goes to a different, entity, but we just happen to be kind of the convenient forum for a lot of those issues. It'll be tough because we're having to resist a lot of people who like coming here and think that we actually have the ability to make that change. But I think the focus on obviously our portfolio and the fact that we are continuing to look at it over the long term, all of these actions, I like the questions. Bill, you keep raising the term materiality, and I kind of sit here and kind of cringe because it's kind of elusive in terms of what that means. But I think the questions that you pose in terms of how you assess each of these issues is kind of the proxy for materiality, right? And so I think if we can be consistent about applying those questions, we're probably going to get to a good point about what we need to prioritize. So thank you for the work. And I also think the interrelationship of these three areas is such that whatever we do, I just think the work that we end up doing on the low carbon transition is going to inform so much on the other two pillars that they're not independent. So thank you for the thoughtfulness.
Thank you, Betty. Gail?
Thank you, and thank you for the work as well. I have two questions. One, I just kind of want to insert my previous comments around the innovation portfolio and seeing how that fits into everything you're doing in the long term, certainly not in whatever time frame you're working on that for, but I do think that'll be an exciting way to see how your engagement work is reflected across all the asset classes in the portfolio. And then on low carbon, on the transition, there's a lot about the carbon economy and the lower carbon economy. There's not specific references to physical risk, which I do think is, as we've seen in California in the last 3 weeks, such a big part of what the low carbon transition looks like, and an opportunity, and probably an area where we need all the greatest minds to really focus and help the state. And I think capital markets and policymakers can really work together on that piece. So I assume that fits into the low carbon transition in general, and certainly I'm not trying to add work to this, but I'm just curious to know if it does in terms of the priorities.
Both points you actually alluded to are, if we rewind almost back to here and say, certainly the innovation portfolio discussions that we started, they would fit in that investment portfolio.
Great.
That's very much what are we doing amongst the assets that we currently have under the team that we look after, and how would we be able to seek new opportunities that we think will be obviously additive to the fund as a whole, and be particularly, invested in climate solutions and other solutions that we think to the sort of shifting global economy. So that would be almost, we're not talking about that today because I see that separately. We'll come back to you with that particular focus on the investment piece, and also what we are doing. Chris is going to be talking a little bit about it today, and then other asset class directors throughout next year about the broader ESG integration across the CalSTRS portfolio. Again, that fits in the investment side. It's trying to sort of clarify that there's both, and we can influence change by allocating capital and influencing behavior. The stewardship is much more about influencing behavior, influencing companies, influencing policymakers to do things differently. The investment is about how we allocate capital to also do that. And to your point, absolutely, on physical risk, what's interesting about the low carbon transition work plan that we've been discussing with you is that it actually fits across all three. It's another area that we need to think about, again, allocation of capital, how we use our influence, and how we manage all of our strategic relationships. And physical risk is probably obviously going to play out most acutely in the companies that we invest in, how it affects them, but also how we invest and think about physical risk across the assets that we have exposure to. So thank you for highlighting both of those.
Thank you very much.
Karen?
Well, thank you for the work. When I think about CalSTRS, I've been told that we have investments in everything, almost everything. So when I go home and I think about, what happened in the news or whatever, or somebody an organization or a corporation comes to CalSTRS wanting different things. So I really appreciate the division or the priorities that you've put out, because otherwise, if we, like Chris says, if we spread ourselves so thin, we can't be effective. So I appreciate the priorities. They sound, well, they're your recommendations of what you've been working on and how you've been spending your resources. So I agree, and I think that by devoting the resources that you have and the staff that you have can be more effective than when we're all over the place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. I don't see anyone else in the queue, so just briefly, and then I want to take a quick break at the end of this meeting, at the end of this item with Joy and Chris, given the time of the day, and see if, look at the agenda. Okay, just a couple of observations. I think there's consensus around the flow chart and the, engagement priorities. One area that we have prioritized over the last several years has been the number of women on corporate boards. There was a woman this morning on one of the business channels very early being interviewed, and she sits on 2 or 3. She may be overboarded now, but she specifically spoke about the progress that has been made relative to the number of women serving on corporate boards. And I couldn't help but feel a little pride about that, knowing that we made that a priority, and we know that diversity on corporate boards actually results in better performance, right? Which is better for shareholders, which goes to Bill's point. So that's an example of where we've put some resources, we've collaborated with others, and we have measurable outcomes. I know Aisha's presented to us, I think, a 10-year period over Fortune 500 companies, the number of women on boards, et cetera. So that's, I think, a perfect example. We're a large pension fund in the 5th largest economy in the world, with great policy leaders, great corporate leaders, and we're in a seat of influence. So I think the deeper, more intense engagements where we can have meaningful, impactful change and build true collaborative, engaging partnerships with companies and company leaders on the important issues that are before us relative to our portfolio is a great challenge for us. And knowing Kirsty just now for about a year and speaking with her, I know she's deeply committed to finding the appropriate way and the determination that it takes to establish a very complex commitment to work with corporate leaders to create the changes that we're looking for. And I think a challenge for us could be sometime in the next few years is actually to have a closed session where the engagement has been embraced, where a company has looked to us and said, we partnered with you, we've changed, and as a result, the returns are better. We're mitigating risks better. We're thinking different about climate. We're thinking different about water. We're thinking different about human capital. We're thinking different about global risks because of our engagement with CalSTRS. That would be, I think, a great celebration for us. But it's going to take a concentrated effort of resources, as well as our true commitment to engage. Sometimes we have disagreements, but there are so many things that we can agree on. That's my challenge. Yes, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, would it be appropriate then for the next meeting in January for us, for number one, to bring forward the proposed top priorities in engagement, And then number two, maybe we also bring forward a proposed policy reading, first reading. Sure. For the framework and the flow chart.
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
I think,
great, thank you.
I don't see any. Chris? Yeah.
I like calling Aisha because we have a live example of where engagement made a difference.
Oh my
CalSTRS only
goodness.
engagement. And in Climate 100.
Yeah, so you actually all have it in front of you, and Duke Energy is one example. I know you. So
Find the most important
find the value of engagement. But Duke Energy is an example where, we were the lead on this engagement, and the company's now established a goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Duke will transition from coal and invest in solar, nuclear, and other carbon-free technologies, as well as natural gas in electricity generation. So I think that's just a really live, current example. Thanks for that.
That's great. And I think it goes back to our offsite. Where appropriate, we want to think about how we share that news and with whom, and we're more proactive about these accomplishments and achievements. So let's think about that as well. Because it's great if we all hear that, it's wonderful. But that's a story that should be shared with a lot of people. I think my colleagues would agree. So we're going to stop this item at this point, so bring it back in January. If I could just, Chris and Joy and I, we're going to take a look at the agenda and see if we can.
Good man. Nicholson, isn't that?
So item 5 is being pulled from the agenda. So we've pulled item 5. Item 6, we are going to hear item 6, which is the cost report. That's Deborah Smith and the investment staff. Deborah, would you come on up? And we have 20 minutes set aside. If you could, if we could get through this in less than 20 minutes, it'd be great. This is an information item.
No pressure.
It's a good information item. We have 4 years
We're
of
gonna put the
costs,
clock up on the.
measuring the cost of the fund. And Paul Rosensteel gets
I
the
was just gonna say.
accolades for pushing on
Paul, if
this
you're
item.
watching.
This is an annual report that we're now getting, and now there's some new data as we're going through this. And so if you could highlight the key points from the report, it'd be helpful and appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keeley. Deborah Smith, the Chief Operating Investment Officer. With me, I have Shafat Hassan, the Director of Investment Compliance and Performance. And we have a new manager with us, Mike Dunnigan. He's been with us for a couple months, but he has been working on CalSTRS account for over 20 years. So he brings a lot of knowledge about our organization, and we're glad to have him as part of our team. I'm excited to bring this report to you today. We have 2 new items this year, and actually one of them has, Scott alluded to it, and as well as Mr. Prezant alluded to it as well, is where this is our first attempt at identifying assets for the collaborative model, and they're identified as hybrid private. So in the previous cost reports, we included these assets in our external management cost. And what we're doing now is carving them out, and we're looking at the hybrid private, and we're going to compare them to external management costs. Mr. Prezant also talked about that 67 basis points. He referenced IMV 58. We do have a slide presentation for that as well. Raylan Lambert just joined us, and she is from Mercer. Mercer helps us collect all those private asset costs, and they are here if you have any questions for them as well. The second thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that we were responsive to your information request. We heard. Oh, I'm sorry. Stephanie works with Raylan at Mercer. I did not see her come up there. Thank you. So the second thing I wanted to mention is we were responsive to your request. We heard you loud and clear that you wanted attribution to the total portfolio costs, and that's included in our report, as well as cost in relation to our asset mix over time. what we continue to do is to build this trend line over time. So we have 4 years worth of data, but for the private assets, costs are more meaningful over a long time horizon, 10 to 20 years. So just keep that in mind as you look through the information. Lastly, before I hand it over to Shafat and Mike, is we participate in the CEM with that cost-effective measurement survey. They bench us to our peers. This year, the investment branch cost savings was $240 million for calendar year 2018. Last year, when we reported to you, I guess it was in January of this year, we reported the 2017 costs. We had a cost savings of $132 million. So I just wanted to let you guys know about those cost savings, and I'll hand it over to Shafat.
Thank you, Deborah. Shafat Hassan, Director, Investment Performance and Compliance. Very pleased to be here today to present the 2018 Annual Investment Cost Report. I'm going to have to admit this information item is full of statistics, data, and numbers, but just to give you the major themes of the report, there are really 3 major themes. The first piece is that what is the 2018 costs, and Mike Dunnigan is going to be presenting that information. The second theme is about the peer comparison that Deborah just mentioned. Like previous years, in 2018, CalSTR's investment branch has been low cost compared to peers. And the last and final key theme is the capture ratio. How do the costs compare to the returns of the portfolio? And that will be the final piece of the presentation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about the 2018 costs.
Introduce yourself. Oh, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Dunnigan, Investment Performance and Compliance. I'd like you to bear with me. I'm a little nervous about the clicker because Kirsty was having some trouble, but we'll see if it works for me. So we'll jump into this right away. So for 2018, the cost report, first we start with the overall investment costs in basis points. I'd like to call out that this information is for calendar year 2018, so it's cut off as of December 31st, 2018, if you're comparing at that point. What we've done with this slide is we've kind of broken out the carried interest from the total portfolio costs. We did sum it along a trend line at the top, but the reason we did this is because the carried interest is basically that profit sharing component of the private assets. We capture it on a cash basis, so as it's actually paid out of the fund, and that's because it's not consistently earned or taken out on a yearly basis as compared to the total portfolio costs, which are 1 year of expenses inclusive of management fees, internal salaries for the staff, operating expenses, and other partnership fees. So getting into the numbers, if we look at the trend line across the top, overall costs did decrease in 2018, but this was a direct result of less carried interest being paid out over the year. If we take the total portfolio costs by themselves, you'll actually see that they jumped up by 5 basis points. The reason that we call this out is, over the history of this cost report, costs have seemed stable, but what we expect as we get more and more data, that you'll see swings over time of the amounts of carried interest that are paid out every year. Even though the last 3 years, everything hovered around 33 to 34 basis points, we finally do see a dip now in 2018. This dip is more of a reflection of general partners, a slowdown in the profits that general partners are realizing over time. So this is a case where even though expenses have dropped, it's also an indicator that returns have probably gone lower. Moving on to the next slide, we're doing investment costs in dollars. This is basically the same information as the first slide, but in actual dollars, and we put the percentage change for 2018 on the right. I'd like to start at the bottom and work my way up, but basically the total overall cost with carried interest that we paid for the year was $1.7 billion. This was a 6% reduction compared to 2017. Obviously, the driver, as I mentioned before, was the 36% reduction in carried interest paid over the year. If we look at total portfolio costs without the carried interest, they actually increased by 14% over the year. This 14% increase was actually attributable to 3 main drivers: overall net asset value growth, the addition of new strategies, and then allocation shifts in the asset mix. For the overall growth, the plan's assets in 2018 grew by $7.5 billion. So this translated into around 3% increase in the overall costs and the fees. For new strategies, our global equity actually finished their transition or their shift from a home country bias to a global structure. This included adding new strategies for external managers that do the strategies that they weren't doing before, that are a little more higher fee structure than the previous internal strategies they had. This attributed to a bump in 5% on management fees. And then asset allocation changes during 2018 included moving assets from the public markets into private asset strategies like real estate and what we call RMS or risk mitigation strategies have a higher fee structure than the public markets. They had an increased allocation, specifically RMS, because they had a target allocation to hit. It got ramped up, and as a result, we saw a comparable increase in the costs. When we look at the cost breakdown, this slide basically illustrates the ratio or the size difference between the amount of carried interest we paid and our total portfolio costs. Inclusive of that, we actually break the total portfolio costs into internal versus external, public versus private. But really what this slide's purpose is, as Deborah mentioned earlier, it's our first attempt to tie the collaborative model to the cost report. The collaborative model, as you may have heard many times, is one of the main goals is to find that optimal balance between internal management and the highest net payoff. So that includes looking at collaborative strategies with external partners. We've tried to carve this out as a new strategy for the purposes of this report. We're calling it the hybrid private management. So this is inclusive of co-investments and then any investments that CalSTRS has significant ownership and control. So that would be anywhere where they have full or primary decision-making capabilities over purchase, finance, and sales. It dropped off this, but I'll show you later. It's 19% of our total costs. We'll jump into that. In addition to breaking this out into internal and external, we've broken out public versus private markets. Private markets, as you can see, accounts for 80% of the total cost. And I know there's a question in one of the earlier items about asset allocation shifting towards this. The expectation is that these assets have a higher net return in the long term. And as you'll see in a couple slides later, over the 4 years that we've been tracking this, they already have a higher net return. When we compare the cost as a percentage of the net asset value, a couple of things have popped out. I mentioned before on the hybrid private management that it's 10% of our plan allocation and 19% of the cost basis. But really what pops out is that the internally managed is still our least expensive category and option. Internally managed accounted for 44% of the total NAV, but only 3% of the costs. When we actually compare that against its counterpart, which would be the external public, you can see that there's a 4 basis point charge per dollar versus an external public manager. The average would be a 36 basis point charge, and that's outlined by the purple arrow. And now that we have carved out the collaborative, we can actually do this for the private markets as well. When we look at the hybrid private, and I know Bill mentioned this in an earlier item, you see the 104 basis point charge for our collaborative strategies, 171 basis point charge for the external private managers. This is a difference of 67 basis points. And if you actually apply that, I know there's a lot of numbers here, but if you apply that 67 basis points to the net asset value of the hybrids, it works out to be $155 million in savings for the year. So this is our first attempt to kind of carve out this shift to the collaborative strategies, potentially saving us this much money, and that's on top of the already balance of internal versus external that's still going on. So with that, if there's no other questions, I'm actually going to turn it over to Shafat to talk about the capture ratio.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So on the screen, what you have is a capture ratio. I'm just going to stress first off that at the end, what really matters is the bottom line, which is the net returns. But this table here kind of tells a nice story about the costs that were incurred to get to that net return. So with that, again, a lot of numbers on this table, but I'm going to draw your attention to the capture ratio column. And if you look across the total portfolio line, you see 89.5% or 90%, let's say. What that means is for every dollar in profits, we were able to bring back 90 cents or capture 90 cents back into the total portfolio. And what does that mean in terms of returns? That 90 cents represents a 5.5% total return on the investments that were made. Using another example, private equity, for every dollar, the portfolio brought back or captured 74 cents of profit, and that represents or corresponds to an 11.5% net return. So again, this is not a black and white analysis. This is just information that's good to have and kind of understand what the portfolio did over time. One of the anomalies that you see here is because of carried interest. It's an odd type of an expense, if you may call it. It makes the capture ratio look unfavorable, but really makes the net returns. It only means that returns have been better. So to me, it's almost like an avocado. It's fat, but it's good fat. So that's what I compare it to. So,
Is that Haas avocado?
So with that, I would just stress again that really the net returns is what we should be stressing on. Again, this tells a very good story about the costs. And with that, on a final note, I'd like to thank this committee. It's your inspiration. We're here today collecting costs and analyzing them at this level. Again, to my knowledge, there are very few funds, if any, that look at costs at this level. So it's something that we can collectively be very proud of. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Shafat. Sharon?
Thanks, Shafat. Thanks, Mike. Nice to meet you. I have a couple questions. One is it, and I apologize because I know we've had a long conversation about fees for many years and Paul's voice is in my ears, but does it help to even talk about carried interest when we think about this cost report anymore? I mean, I know when we first started talking about it and it was in the news and there was a lot of attention, but in my mind, as I've become more educated, it's tied to, private equity returns. And it just seems like some of the charts that you showed earlier, it almost looks kind of deceptive, or I don't know. It just seems like, I don't know if Mercer, if you guys have an opinion on that, but like I think the first slide, I don't have the slide numbers on, I guess slide number 2, Mike, that you were going through the bar chart. Just looking at the carried interest, for me, I guess, it looks like, oh, it's gone down, right? So that's a good thing, but it's not really, because that means our private equity didn't perform strong. So I'm always thinking about how this translates to our stakeholders and people out there in the world, because part of the reason why we had this cost report at the beginning was just to say, we want to have more transparency about the cost to our fund. And if we're going to spend money and hire more investment staff, we want there to be value, and we want to communicate that to the public. And so I guess that's just a question I have is that a valuable part as we think about moving forward and continuing this report? And have you guys talked about that? And I was curious what Mercer thought about that as well.
I'll just kick it off, and
Sure.
maybe others can chime in later. So first off, I think it is an important metric to kind of evaluate what's happening in the portfolio. It is where you will see a lot of the savings that come from the collaborative strategies that are in place. So I think it's important. It's an important metric to have. It can be deceptive, like you said, but it is a cost, and it needs to be monitored and looked at, and we can narrow the gap between net and gross by monitoring it actively and negotiating those terms. So with that, I think, I don't know, Mike.
Yeah, the only thing that I would throw out is it's one of the reasons why I separated. I think it should be looked at differently. Yes, we want to look at overall cost, but we want to examine the trends. I think when we get a lot more data, we have a longer time period, you can start to analyze. This is, as I mentioned, paid out on a cash basis. And so there's not an accrual. You can't tell how it fluctuates necessarily with the market, because it could be multiple years before a general partner would want to actually realize this portion. So that's why it's deceptive. But as Shafat did mention, if we're moving towards this collaborative model to do these collaborative strategies, and part of that is to reduce even the carried interest portion of that, you do want to track it over time. And I think you need a long timeline to really have meaningful information. But when we do, I think it'll be valuable.
The question is like how we track it, what's the best way to communicate that in the report moving forward in the collaborative model. So yeah. I feel like we're just tweaking this report every year, I guess, and obviously we'll be.
It's been great to see it evolve. Raylan Lambert from Mercer Alternatives. I do think that reporting carried interest is industry best practice to capture it. And it does show, to Shafat's point about when you're also able to negotiate more preferable carried interest rates relative to what might be in the standard agreement, that you are capturing cost savings there. I think part of it could just maybe be on semantics, where your costs, your direct costs are your carried interest or partnership expenses. You might want to look at carried interest as sort of profit sharing, right? It's really just more of a semantic change, and but I do think including it is helpful. And also the charts, the capture ratio, seeing how that translates in the fat avocado analogy to the actual net returns being generated, I think also shows a more complete and accurate picture.
And then can I just ask for you, did you want to add something, Scott, to that?
I did, actually, thank you. So I would concur with what's being said, but I'm excited that we are measuring the collaborative model in this hybrid format, because number one, that's great for us to start to measure that. But it highlights the difficulty in measuring it year by year. I think we're going to have to look at it from a long-term perspective, because the carried interest is going to be changing. It's volatile based on the return stream, right? Did they perform better or worse in a year? So while we can start to measure the collaborative model, there's a lot of nuances here that we're going to be reporting on and having to explain in greater detail to the board. But I think it brings up a good point that it's going to be difficult to measure it from year to year. And really, we want to look over a long-term cycle. How's this trending?
And can I just ask one last question? Is just industry practice, are other institutional investors in the U.S. capturing these kinds of costs in an annual report? I'm just kind of curious across the U.S. in institutional investors if there is this kind of cost reporting happening.
I haven't seen anything this extensive. I know Shafat's, and the team has had conversations and industry best practices with a lot of other institutions, but in our work, this is certainly the most comprehensive. The other point I wanted to clarify too is a lower BIPS carried interest number doesn't necessarily indicate that the portfolio is underperforming. It's also tied to when realization activity occurs. So it just means that even though it's 20, that you could have, deals close at different points in time. Some of that could be pushed into the following calendar year. So it doesn't necessarily, I don't want you to think that means the portfolio is underperforming. It just means the realization activity was down this year, but the underlying value of the portfolio could still be quite strong.
I can answer your question, Sharon. Chris Hellman. I'll use this chart as an illustration. I think in 2015, we were probably one of two. Then it went up to 5, and now we're approaching probably 10 to 15 plans. Us in South Carolina are probably the most. Most plans only do private equity. We're the only one so far that I'm aware of that does all the asset classes. Our global peers, particularly Australia, and some of the Canadians are talking about finding a way. It's the profit sharing part that's just so hard to calculate. You actually, like you're saying, you want that number to be huge because that meant your share of the profits was giant. So, and realize that we do have quite a few global equity managers that are on an incentive fee basis. So when they outperform, they get a higher fee. So that's what makes it measuring fees hard to figure out.
Thanks. Dana and then Joy.
So I'm wondering if, because carried interest is only one element of what we pay out. So if we're not looking at the total picture, but we're just looking at carried interest, is that giving us a skewed perspective?
We're looking at both. So the total portfolio cost, that blue bar that we show, again, this is Mike Dunnigan, sorry, investment performance and compliance. That's actually management fees, internal salaries, and operating expenses. So we actually track that and apply it to all of the portfolios.
External fees are included
Yes,
in that?
all external and internal. This is an entire picture of all the expenses paid out by CalSTRS.
So if we want to know the difference or track the difference of what in-house and external is, why would we include external fees in the total portfolio? Or is that just one element of the measurements that you're tracking?
It's one element. So when I started off this presentation, we started off with total cost to CalSTRS. As I went down and got into those pie charts, that's actually a breakdown of internal versus external fees. But this is the total, and then we divided it up further.
That would be the next slide?
Remember the table slide you had?
Sorry.
A lot of animation. Keep going, keep going. A little too clever for, one more. If I can help answer that, Michael. There we go. So look at the purple reference points. So when we talk about internal, external, that's where he was saying that's public markets. That's where most of our internal is. And then that's why they're trying to do the green comparison is kind of what we think roughly the collaborative model costs versus traditional outside private markets cost. It's easier to break down between public and privates because the costs are so different between those two.
And just to add, if you summed up the cost here, it's 1.2 billion. So that would tie to those blue bars. Basically, the 2008 blue bar would equal $1.2 billion.
Thank you.
Joy?
Thank you. You know, some of the questions that I had were raised by Dana and Sharon, so I think I just want to take a minute to thank you, you know, for the work we continue to do. I think we're such a leader in what we're doing here, and the additional levels of analysis that you're able to share with us, both in terms of peer comparison, you know, despite the very tricky animation, I think being able to call out, you know, highlight, it really was effective in highlighting some of the areas that I think are really worth thinking about. And Scott, I understand your point that year over year, it might be hard to look at the what our costs look like on the collaborative model, but you know, we already are performing so well benchmarked to our peers that as we expand the portion of the portfolio that's under the collaborative model, I think we'll, you know, you will really continue to lead the pack and widen the distance. So great work.
Thank you, Joy. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the report and the continued work. INV 59 captures it for me. CalSTRS equates to approximately $240 million saved compared to its peers. $130 million last year. It's 370. That's something to feel pretty good about. And if someone could just help me validate how you get that number before we move on to the next item, that would be reassuring to me. Because that's only at CalSTRS with $240 million just be, we saved $240 million compared to what our peers did.
Right. So Deborah Smith, Chief Operating Investment Officer. So that $240 million is coming from CEM, that cost-effective measurement provider. They're a subset of what you're receiving here. Our report is more comprehensive than that CEM. So CEM doesn't include things like carried interest or, some of those other type of cost components or profit sharing components, but they take about 15 global peers and compare us to that. And they're looking at if those peers had our asset mix, how would they perform? And they're saying that we outperform those peers by $240 million overall. So that information is coming from a different provider than this report.
That's enough.
It's enough for Harry's brain,
Thank you very much. It's
Gotcha.
really an
That was
excellent
really great.
report, and nice to meet you.
Yeah.
You too.
Yeah.
And thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, Richard.
So we have a couple of information items, and I'm going to suggest that we receive these information items unless there are questions from the committee. The first information item is the education application of ESG policies, which is an information item. I don't know if committee members had questions for staff on this item. Nope. So we'll just receive that, Chris. May the record note that we received the information in item number 7. Item 8, Stephen.
Can I ask a quick question, though, just about the item?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Weigh in. Sure.
I'm totally fine with us not looking at this today. Just, it's something that I know stakeholders have asked us about, is like, how do we integrate ESG into our policies? So it looks like in the next steps, there's gonna be like firsthand examples of how we integrate ESG, right? So in January, we'll have more I just want to make sure we
Not
don't.
in January.
Oh.
Your January meeting is already full.
That is
We have
true.
decided
I
to
did
get
look at that.
clever, and I have asked each of the asset classes. So every meeting will have one private, one public asset class. I've asked them to shoot a video with live examples, which I thought would be helpful for you of how they did that on a manager. So that will be closed session material that we'll send to you. They will also shoot kind of a summary, if we can figure out how to do it for open session, for education. Put them all out there on the web and let you guys then see those. That would be the most efficient way, and it's effective for them. The January agenda lands right over Christmas time, and this is more effective for shooting a casual video of just talking to you and giving you live examples
We
of it.
can just make sure there's something for open session, just so
Yes.
that, I
Yeah.
just think a lot of our stakeholders have asked how we integrate it, so,
Yep.
yeah.
We'll
It's
put
on
some
our radar.
education pieces out there.
Perfect, awesome.
Item 8. Pardon? Oh, so there are questions. No, go ahead.
sorry.
Dana, go ahead.
It just, so Chris, my question earlier about the, let me find my notes. The corporate governance principles,
Yeah.
would that tie into this as well? As an education of how we incorporate it?
Sure. we
Because
can,
this is
yes,
where,
but
because
SIS
this is
would be
where I
part of
pulled
this.
the other
Yeah.
3 from?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Item 8 is also an information item on the risk mitigation strategies report from Jeff and Stephen. We had some comments and we had information in closed session. Does anyone have questions for the open session, item number 8? If not, we'll just receive the information as it's been presented and assume that everyone's read it. Sharon?
All I'll say is, again, I know that there were questions from stakeholders, obviously attention to the trend following and global macro, kind of the returns and wanting a little more information about that. So I haven't seen them pop up or ask for public comment. I guess I just wanted to, since we're not discussing it, just wanted to mention that that's the hedge fund strategy issues just come up before. It has been an area of concern, so I just wanted to throw it out there. I don't have questions about it, but.
We'll encourage them to read the item.
Yep.
Gail?
So I'm happy to have this conversation offline or at another time. I'm not sure I understood your point on hedge fund exposure in the write-up. Was that just me not? I don't know.
The team can come forward in case.
Or
I
we
don't
could,
give an
I'm happy to.
adequate answer, but I would
But if no one else
encourage.
shares the question, I'm happy to defer it and have an offline.
Well, no, it relates to the, many of the members in the back of the room. There has been a lot of confusion. The word hedge fund is so broad. I turn your attention to INV 100. That chart, figure 3. When people say the word hedge fund, they got to realize that it's 5 different strategies and
Right. No, I
about
understood
20
that
things.
piece.
Sharon had a concern. Many people said, oh, so are your hedge funds beating the market? We want them to be different than the market. And of all those crazy styles, we only use 3. So it's really trying to drive the point home that a hedge fund isn't a particular thing. It's just a legal contract. And we only use certain strategies. And the reason we use them is they're actually different than the market. So when they do outperform the market, I'm going to be really sad because that probably means the market went down a whole bunch. But that's their whole point, is to balance us. So it's a different kind of a concept. But she had asked that we present the performance so that people could understand how we've done in these. That answer it?
And this is, well,
No?
sorry. I mean, it answers the definition question, but it doesn't answer how it, and these are done through partnership. This is the Lixor partnership.
These are, Lixor is the, in essence, think the custodian. It tracks the underlying decisions. Those are external partnership managers that we hire for each of those strategies.
what
And they're all
percentage
in the RMS portfolio.
Okay.
And they're done because they tend to move differently than the way they don't just invest in stocks, they invest in other things to counterbalance our equity portfolio.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you had there additional follow-ups, Stephen Tong would be
Okay.
the appropriate person to follow up with.
Great.
He's
Thank
really
you. I appreciate it.
been the captain of this ship on that. Okay. Yeah, it's getting late.
It's all good.
CIO report, Chris, item 9, information.
Very quick.
Yep.
My PowerPoint's still a work in progress on accessibility, but I think I'll have it next time. For the members in the back of the room, we touched a record high at Halloween of $246 billion. The equity market rally has taken us back to kind of almost neutral to the asset allocation, so we'll look at that. Fiscal year to date, returns are about halfway where we want them to be for the year. So that's good. 2019, the returns you're going to hear about are going to likely be well double digit, maybe north of 20%. But you have to pay attention to the longer term graph. Remember last Christmas Eve, market dropped, what, 600 on Christmas Eve? So if you back up and look at the last 2 years, markets are basically averaging 3% a year over the last 2 years. So, and same thing with non-US. The yield curve is actually now back to positively sloped, not much, but barely. And my long-term risks have not changed. The one thing I would remind everybody is Brexit. Anybody for down the road? So that is still out there. Don't even. That just sends her through the roof. So some people on her staff, like Mike DeRay, have a fun time kidding her about being the creation of democracy.
One question, Chris. Since we last met, Governor Newsom put out an executive order. Can you just update us in terms of the conversations that are appropriate to that issue? Thanks.
Jack and I and Kirsty met with Gail in the Department of Finance last week. I think it's public. They've met with all 3 of the funds. I've tried to talk to the CIOs, but they've been hard to get a hold of. At this point, the tentative idea from finance is to have 3 meetings, one for the funds to get together, but then a second one maybe in the first quarter to kind of coordinate what we're doing and see if there are items and areas that we can work on together. And then eventually maybe a 3rd meeting in the second quarter with the governor to see what we can work on to announce. And I hope I was not breaching the covenant there. So working closely with finance, and we'll keep you informed. Right now, it's just time and meetings, not a big resource, but it's educating everybody on what all 3 of us are doing.
Yeah, thanks. I think the point was just to make sure that everyone knew that we were responsive to the executive order and looking to collaborate with the appropriate parties where there's an opportunity to do so with policymakers, as well as looking to the investors for the opportunities that might surface as a result of this work together, and our commitment to do that in true partnership. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Brings us to information requests. Stephen, do we have many? We didn't, right? We didn't have any information requests today. Good.
We got a lot of information.
We had a lot. There was a lot going on today. We have the draft agenda for next meeting. I don't think it's, unless there's something someone sees on the agenda that we need to review at this point, I don't think we need this.
Yeah, there are a lot of changes I have to make to that. And given today's testimony or public comments, I'll try and figure out how we work that agenda with Jack. But it times out to about 4 hours.
Okay. We already received the opportunities for the public to address us today. Thanks, everyone. It's been a productive day. Thank you.